Hello, women's writing students, and welcome to your week 4 lecture pod. This week is going to be slightly different. We're going to be setting aside just for this week some of our primary readings, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more on preparing for assessment 1. We've already been doing lots of close readings in the classroom that's going to help us with that assignment, but I wanted to take some time in the course of the semester to actually sit down and do a couple of things that are really explicit to preparing for the assessment. So this workshop is about helping you to prepare for assessment 1, and I'm going to run through a couple of things in the lecture pod today, which we will kind of recap a little bit in class. One of the things I really want to focus on is the secondary reading. There's a lot of secondary reading on the View site, and hopefully some of you have already been looking at some of that. Narelle and I have also been bringing some of that in, bringing it into the lecture pods. I've taken some quotations from some of those secondary materials, and we've chatted about some of the arguments that some of those critics have been making about the Maria Edgeworth text that we have been reading. But I want to take a more intensive focus on some of that secondary literature, think about how best we can utilize it. Some of the other things that we're going to be doing in the classroom: we're going to be having a look at our questions. We're going to be doing some analysis of the questions. We're going to be breaking them down, brainstorming them a little bit, and thinking quite closely about how we can come up with some ideas, maybe some sort of preliminary ideas, some planning for your assignment. We're also going to do a bit of a reminder of the referencing style that you're supposed to be using as well. And as I say, we're going to make some time as well for you guys to be able to ask some questions if you need to ask some questions about assessment 1. So if we have a look at these slides here, I've just broken down the lecture pod into 3 sections, and I'm going to spend most of the time actually on section 3, on thinking about research. But let's just kind of recap a little bit some of the key skills that you will need for assessment 1. And the first one obviously is a skill that you use across all of your writing assignments, which is literacy. I did send out an announcement last week, and we talked about it a little bit in class in week 3. Just a reminder that there are some library support services that will help you in preparing for your written assignments. The Study Smart service is a fabulous service. You can spend up to 20 minutes face-to-face with a tutor in the library. You can take a draft of your assessment if you want to. You can take the questions if you just need a bit of extra help in looking at those questions again, or getting some ideas of how you might put your assignment together. So please do make use of that service if you think it will be helpful to you. It's great to get a sort of second pair of eyes over your ideas, and also a second pair of eyes over some of your drafting, in case there's any kind of extra proofreading that somebody can help you to do. So you can, if you have a look at the link on the slide, if you go to that link, it will give you all the information about booking in with a tutor, or even accessing one of the online tutors as well. There's also another person in our school, in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts, who is a wonderful support actually for literacy. Some of you may know Dr. Helen Vasides. She also runs English units in the English major, but she also works as our literacy support tutor. Now, Helen usually works quite intensively and one-on-one with students, and it's usually students that get referred to her. So what I would say at this point is, if you have past units, past essays which you've written for English major units, and you have been picked up perhaps more than once for literacy, if you feel that sometimes your grades are being pulled down, or you've even failed assignments due to poor literacy or weak literacy, this is the kind of language or the kind of feedback that you've been getting, let me know. You can drop me an email, you can pop into my office hour and come and have a chat. If you're in any way concerned that there might be literacy issues with your paper and you're really keen to improve some of that, let me know, and I can hook you up with Helen, and she can maybe look at some of your past essays and give you some advice. She's been wonderful working with a lot of my students actually, who I've referred to her, whose grades have soared as a result of working with her a little bit on their literacy. So that's just something for you to think about on your own, and to approach me or to approach Narelle if you think maybe having a session with Helen would be useful for you. The other skill that you're going to be bringing into this, and that we've been practicing week after week in these first couple of weeks, is our close reading. So this is really essentially a close reading assignment. It's asking you to look at particular pages, particular passages in the stories that we have been reading across weeks 2 and 3, but also that we will be reading across weeks 5 and 6 as well with the Shelley. And why are we doing that? Well, again, close reading is such an essential skill in English, and it's such a great transferable skill. Whatever employment you go into once you graduate, there will always be documents and materials that you will have to read, that you will have to analyze. You'll sometimes have to summarize. You may have to make arguments about this material that you're reading. So close reading is just a wonderful kind of transferable skill. So we have been spending some time doing close readings together, and I would remind you, one of the things I try to remind students when they're preparing for their essays, whenever you're making a point, you're going to be building an argument in response to a question, as we've been doing in class with our close readings. And every time with those responses, I've been asking you, and Narelle's been asking you, to always attach them to a certain part of the text. Where are you actually getting your argument from? Is it something about that's not, is it the dialogue? Is it something that somebody says in the text? Is it something to do with the tone? Or have you picked up on some kind of metaphor or some kind of symbolism in the text, which is helping you to make your points and build your argument? Textual detail, quotations from the text, a demonstration that you've read that text in detail and very closely is always very, very good and sought after in this kind of an assignment. So I would try to bear that in mind. The skills we've been trying to build in the first couple of weeks are the skills we want to see you utilising in your first assessment. And we've been collecting our notes together as well. So there's a lot of kind of revision notes now on the Views site. You can go back and remind yourself of some of the useful quotations and the useful points that we've been making, and they might be helpful to you in building your argument in your essay. So I would refer you back to some of that work that we have been doing and that we will continue to do with the Shelley. I want to turn our attention a little bit to research, because we haven't had an awful amount of time to focus intensively on some of the readings and resources for this unit. We largely rely on students to be using their independent study time to be accessing those materials and to be reading them and to be bringing some of those ideas into the classroom as we discuss the texts. But it is worth just reminding you where those materials are, what they look like, and why we're getting you to read them. So let's work our way through some of these questions on the slide. First of all, what secondary resources are you asked to read on this unit? Well, I have asked you to have a look. I've posted 2 articles or book chapters, usually relatively short, and I've listed 2 per week on the readings and resources list on Views. In the first couple of weeks, you'll notice they were quite broad. They were very generalised resources that were about women's writing and 19th century short stories. They were looking at the genre and how women have used that genre in the 19th century. Most of the other resources are more specific to the text that we are studying, so they make critical arguments around the stories that we are looking at. And it's worth thinking about those different types of resources and what they do, and how it's useful to maybe bring in stuff that's more contextual, maybe about genre or women's writing more generally, and where it's useful in an essay to bring in things that are much more direct and specific to the text. So we'll look at some of that in the workshop. Where can they be found? Readings and resources list on Views. That's pretty straightforward. Why do we ask you to read them? That's a slightly more complex question, and I want to work our way through a couple of things around why we ask you to read them. It's always worth bearing these in mind. It gives you a framework for when you actually approach these materials. Why are you reading them? Why are they useful? And how can you make them useful? So first of all, the simplest answer, I think, to that question is that we are trying to encourage students to engage with the range and diversity of critical opinions, interpretations, and socio-historical contexts which exist in relation to particular texts, authors, and genres. I guess in the classroom, you're being exposed to the range and diversity of critical opinions of your peer group and of me. I'm bringing a range of critical opinions and interpretations into the classroom. Many of them are my own critical opinions and interpretations. But it's great to actually read some of those other materials, because some of those critics take quite a different approach actually to some of the text. You might find counter arguments in there as well. But it's good to get a sense of the diversity of opinions around a text, so you have a good sense of what people are talking about when it comes to thinking about this kind of text. The second reason that I've got listed here is to simply help students understand aspects of the text that they are studying, which they might otherwise find difficult. So sometimes you might find some of the stories quite challenging. You might read them and think, I don't really know what this story is going on about, or I can't really think what the key debates and issues in this story are. So sometimes accessing some of that secondary literature helps you to get a sense of what some of those debates are. You know, why are people interested in this text? And what do they start to talk about when they read these texts? The third reason I've got listed here is to assist students in developing their own critical skills and interpretive abilities, as well as their academic writing style. And I have suggested here that it's important to always read the full resource. Don't just skim read for suitable quotations. You're trying to understand the whole argument in the critical resources that you're using. You can sometimes misapply quotations when you haven't read the full thing and you don't really understand the context within which the critic has been making their argument. But it also brings me to another important point about why we get you to read secondary resources. And this is something that students often don't pay a lot of attention to, or sometimes they just don't know to pay attention to it, which is why I want to talk about it. And that is, you're reading some of this material because actually you're looking to develop your own academic voice, your own critical voice. And by looking at how other people have put together an argument, how other people use secondary resources, how other people bring in textual detail from a primary text, that's actually helping you to develop your essay writing skills. On the slide here, I've got a very quick extract from Julia Wright's essay on terror and terrorism in the Limerick Gloves. And I'm hoping that some of you will remember when you did approaches to text that we had a sort of systematic approach to close reading primary text. And we said that we often try to make an observation about the text first, then we describe that observation, and then we try to interpret it. And that's one way of starting to build an argument. And one of the things that it's worth looking at when you're reading other people's arguments, when you're reading this secondary literature, think about how they've looked at a text. And they're often doing the same thing. They're observing and describing and interpreting. And often each paragraph is kind of following that formula a little bit. Not everywhere, but in quite a few places. So think about why we got you to do that: observe, describe, interpret. And think about how other critics use that to build a really strong and convincing argument. On the slide, you can see here, I've picked out one sort of short paragraph from Julia Wright's essay. And you can see here that she's making a clear observation at the beginning. And her observation is that the religious basis for fears of terrorism in England is comparatively muted, yet it is also clearly present in Edgeworth's narrative. That's quite a clear and quite a succinct observation about the text and about this idea of the religious basis for terrorism. She says it's there, and yet it's a little bit muted. So that's her observation, that's her point. Then she begins to describe it. She actually gives an example. For instance, and then she gives this kind of example. She takes a quotation from the text, and then she extends that example, that description of her observation. Hill is also a church warden, and the cathedral, rather than a public secular building, as a target, intensifying the religious underpinnings of the narrative. So she uses another sort of example. She extends her description. And then she comes to her conclusion, her sort of interpretation of that textual detail. She says, even as the story offers enlightenment reason as the solution to sectarian violence, it transforms religious terrorism into Irish terrorism. So she makes a sort of conclusion or interpretation. So when you're doing your secondary reading, use it also as a kind of exemplar. How has somebody else built an argument? And how can I use that to build my own arguments as well, and make them convincing and use textual detail in useful ways? Finally, our other reason, to help students find suitable commentaries to support their own argument and usefully shape their ideas and influence their thinking. Remember that your own interpretation needs to form the core of your essay. Try to not let your secondary reading replace your own views, okay? So you're looking for other narratives and commentaries that help support your argument, but your critical voice is the most important one. It's your building of your argument. These other things support your argument in particular ways, but don't ever let the secondary reading dominate. Don't let the secondary reading become your argument. You're making an argument outside of that. It's a kind of a support for you, but it shouldn't close off your own critical voice. So how can I use critical resources in my essay? And this is something we'll talk about a bit more in class. One, we often use them to support and extend our own interpretations of a text. So you might have you've done your close reading, you've looked at your question, you've planned out your essay a little bit, and you've started to do your own close reading of the text, and you're coming to your own interpretation, your own opinions of the text in response to the question. Secondary materials can help support that. Sometimes you find things and you think, yeah, that's great, that's sort of where I'm going, that helps to back up my point. And so you bring it into your essay. Sometimes you might want to provide some context to your interpretation. If you want to talk about genre, for example, we've talked a lot about didactic short stories, educational short stories. You might want to make a point about that, and sometimes you want to contextualize it. So you want to kind of bring in the historical context around educational stories, moral stories, the kind of genre that Edgeworth, for example, was working in. So sometimes we need to bring in context, and secondary materials can help us to do that. In fact, if you look at the Julia Wright essay, she also does that. She brings in a lot of historical context to back up the things that she wants to say, to help give a framework to what she wants to say. The third thing, and again, I don't often see this in undergraduate essays, but I do quite like to see it actually, is that sometimes it can act as a useful counter-argument. Sometimes you read critical literature and you might be thinking, well, actually, I don't agree. I don't agree with that point that they're making about the text. That's certainly not how I would interpret it or how I would approach it. And so it's sometimes a useful way of bringing in a counter-argument. You can suggest that Julia Wright argues that whatever she argues, X, Y, or Z. But that actually, if you look at this part of the text, for example, we can see that something else is happening, or there's some other way of interpreting this particular point. So sometimes you want to bring it in as a counter-argument. That can be quite effective sometimes. It also demonstrates a really good grasp of your secondary resources, and it's that way of asserting your own critical voice. So these are just some of the things that we are going to cover in week 4, and I hope this has given you just a bit of a flavour of what we're going to be doing in the workshops, and just a bit of a heads up. So I look forward to seeing you in classes in week 4 on Wednesday. In the meantime, take good care, and I will see you very soon.